It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the city streets glisten under the weight of a fresh downpour. Expensive cars rolled by, their tires slicing through shallow puddles, spraying water onto the sidewalks. Inside one of those cars, a sleek, black Rolls-Royce, sat a man who had everything the world could offer: wealth, power, and success. Richard Langston, a self-made billionaire, barely noticed the world outside as he checked his phone, skimming through emails, investment reports, and messages from people who always seemed to want something from him. The traffic light ahead turned red, forcing his driver to slow down. Richard sighed, impatient. He hated being stuck in traffic. His eyes flicked up from his phone, glancing out the tinted window. That's when he saw him. A man on the sidewalk, drenched from the rain, holding a small cardboard sign with shaky hands. The letters were faded, the words barely legible. Hungry, need help, God bless. Richard had seen thousands like him before. Beggars standing on street corners, holding signs, hoping for a few dollars from passing cars. He rarely paid attention. He had worked too hard to be where he was. No one had ever handed him anything, but something about this man made him pause. The way he stood, his posture, oddly familiar, his face, though aged and tired, stirred something deep in Richard's memory. And then his eyes fell on something else, around the man's wrist, barely visible under the soaked sleeve of an old tattered jacket, was a watch. Not just any watch, a vintage Rolex. His grandfather's Rolex. Richard's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't possible. That watch had been in his family for generations. His grandfather had worn it every day of his life, passing it down to Richard's father, who then gave it to Richard on his 18th birthday. But that watch was stolen years ago. Gone, lost forever. And now, here it was, on the wrist of a man standing in the rain, begging for change. 100 questions rushed through Richard's mind. Who was this man? How did he get the watch? Was it really the same one? His gut told him it was. He could never forget it. The worn leather strap, the small scratch on the bezel, the engraving on the back that read, "Time is precious, LL." His grandfather's initials. Before he could stop himself, Richard reached for the door handle. His driver, startled, turned to him. "Sir, what are you doing?" "Pull over," Richard ordered, his voice sharp, urgent. "But just do it." The Rolls-Royce eased onto the curb, the rain drumming against its polished surface. Richard stepped out, the cold wind hitting him instantly. He barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the man in front of him. The beggar looked up, startled, as Richard approached. His eyes, dark, weary, but familiar, met Richard's. A flicker of recognition passed between them, though neither of them spoke right away. The man clutched his sign tighter, as if preparing for rejection. Richard's voice was steady, but laced with something unexpected. "Where did you get that watch?" The man hesitated, glancing down at his wrist, as if he had forgotten the watch was even there. Then, after a long silence, he finally answered. "It was a gift," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "A long time ago." Richard felt his stomach twist. There was more to this story, and he needed to know the truth. Richard stared at the man, his heart pounding in his chest. The rain poured down harder now, soaking through his expensive suit, but he didn't care. His mind was racing. How could this man, a beggar on the street, have something so precious, something that had belonged to his grandfather? "A gift?" Richard repeated, his voice sharp. His eyes never left the watch. The man nodded slowly. hesitating as if he was carefully choosing his words. He looked down at the Rolex, his fingers tracing the scratched glass. "Yes," he said finally. "From someone I once knew, a long time ago." Richard narrowed his eyes. There was something off about the way the man spoke, like he was holding something back. His clothes were ragged, his hands rough and calloused, but there was something familiar in his face, something Richard couldn't shake. "Who gave it to you?" Richard pressed. The man swallowed hard. His gaze flickered away for a moment, like he was debating whether to answer. Then, finally he sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of whatever secret he was carrying. "It belonged to a man named Leonard Langston," the man said quietly. "Many years ago." Richard felt like the ground had just shifted beneath him. His grandfather's name. There was no mistaking it now. This was his watch. "That was my grandfather," Richard said, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. "How did you get it?" The man flinched, his expression unreadable. He took a step back, gripping the sign in his hand, like it was the only thing holding him together. He looked like he wanted to run. "I knew him," the man admitted. His voice was softer now, almost hesitant. "He was a good man, a kind man." Richard clenched his jaw. His grandfather had been one of the few people in his life who had shown him real kindness. He had built his wealth from nothing, working his way up, and always told Richard that money meant nothing if you didn't have integrity. And yet, here was a homeless man claiming to have known him. "I don't believe you," Richard said, his voice cold now. "That watch was stolen years ago. You expect me to believe my grandfather gave it to you?" The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I never said he gave it to me." Richard's stomach twisted. He could feel the answer lingering in the air, heavy and unspoken. "Then how do you have it?" The man looked down, rain dripping from his face. He was silent for a long time, before he finally whispered, "Because I stole it." Richard froze. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. A wave of anger crashed over him, mixed with something else, something he didn't want to name. "You stole from my grandfather." His voice was low, dangerous. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Yes," he admitted. "A long time ago, and I have lived with that regret every single day since." Richard didn't know what to say. He had expected a lie, an excuse, something to justify what this man had done, but there was none. Just raw honesty. "Why?" Richard demanded. "Why would you steal from a man like him?" The man sighed, his shoulders slumping, his fingers tightened around the watch. "Because I was desperate. I was young, stupid. I had nothing, and I thought taking something valuable would change that." He looked up, his eyes filled with something Richard didn't expect, guilt. "But I was wrong. Your grandfather found out, and do you know what he did?" Richard shook his head, unable to speak. "He forgave me," the man said, his voice breaking. "He didn't call the police. He didn't have me arrested. He sat me down and told me that life isn't about what you take. It's about what you give. He told me to do better, to be better." The man let out a shaky breath. "But I didn't listen. I wasted my life. I let everything slip away. And now, here I am." Silence, stretched between them, thick and heavy. Richard's hands loosened at his sides. The anger that had burned inside him a moment ago was still there, but now it was tangled with something else. Pity. Understanding. He didn't know. He had spent his whole life chasing success, proving himself, making sure he was never weak, never vulnerable. And yet, here was this man, broken and defeated, holding the only piece of his grandfather that Richard had left. The rain continued to fall, washing over them both. "Why are you still wearing it?" Richard asked, after a long pause. This man looked down at the Rolex, his thumb brushing over the engraving. "Because it reminds me of the man I should have been." His voice was barely above a whisper. "And the man I failed to become." Richard swallowed hard. The storm inside him was louder than the one outside. He had spent so many years believing that strength meant never looking back, never second-guessing. But now, standing here in the rain, staring at a man who had once stolen from his family, but now carried the weight of his mistakes, he wasn't so sure anymore. He took a deep breath. "Come with me," he said finally. The man blinked, confused. "What?" "Come with me," Richard repeated. "Get in the car." The man hesitated. "Why?" Richard didn't have an answer. Not yet. All he knew was that something about this moment felt bigger than him, bigger than his anger, bigger than the watch. "Because my grandfather believed in second chances," Richard said. "And maybe it's time I do too." The man stared at him for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. And just like that, Richard stepped aside, holding the car door open. The past couldn't be changed. But maybe, just maybe, the future could. The man hesitated for a long moment, his eyes flicking from Richard to the open car door. The rain kept falling, drumming against the pavement, filling the silence between them. Richard could see the doubt on the man's face, the war inside him. Maybe he had spent too long in the shadows, too long believing he didn't deserve a way out. But then, slowly, almost cautiously, he stepped forward. His hands trembled as he reached for the door handle, as if afraid this was all a cruel trick. When he finally slid into the seat, he let out a breath, one that sounded like he had been holding it for years. Richard got in beside him, and the driver, still visibly confused, pulled away from the curb. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The city lights blurred past, the soft hum of the car filling the space between them. Richard stole a glance at the man, watching as he stared down at the Rolex on his wrist, running his fingers over the worn leather strap, like it was the only thing anchoring him. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "What's your name?" The man looked up, startled. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, like he wasn't sure if he should say. But after a moment, he exhaled and said, "James." Richard nodded, rolling the name over in his mind. He wanted to ask more, where James had been all these years, how he ended up on the streets, why he never tried to turn things around. But something told him those answers wouldn't come easy. Instead, he said, "Ah, you hungry?" James hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I am." Richard tapped the front of the car. "Take us somewhere good," he told the driver. They pulled into a quiet diner on the edge of the city, one of those old-fashioned places with checkered floors and the smell of coffee lingering in the air. It wasn't the kind of place Richard usually went, but something about it felt right. Inside, James sat stiffly, like he didn't belong, like any second someone would tell him to leave. But no one did. A waitress came over, smiling warmly, and handed them menus. "Order whatever you want," Richard told him. James glanced down at the menu, his fingers gripping the edges. "I haven't had a real meal in a long time," he admitted quietly. Richard's chest tightened. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. They ordered, and as they waited for their food, James finally spoke again. "I lost everything," he said, staring at the table. "After I stole that watch, I thought I was getting away with something big. I sold it to a pawn shop, spent the money like it would last forever." He shook his head. "But your grandfather, he found me again. I don't know how, but he did." Richard tensed. What did he do? James let out a soft, bitter chuckle. He bought the watch back. And then he found me, sitting outside some run-down motel, broke and ashamed. His voice turned quieter. I thought he was going to turn me in. I would have deserved it. But he didn't. Instead, he sat next to me and said, "You still have time to make this right." Richard swallowed hard. That sounded exactly like something his grandfather would have said. James sighed. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But I kept making bad choices. I lost jobs, burned bridges, and eventually, I lost myself. I found that same watch years later in another pawn shop, and I bought it back, not because I thought I could fix everything, but because I needed to hold on to something real. He looked up at Richard then, his eyes tired but sincere. I never let it go after that. Richard didn't know how to respond. Part of him still felt the anger, the injustice of it all. His grandfather's kindness wasted on a man who had thrown it away. But another part of him, a part he rarely listened to, felt something else, understanding. Their food arrived, and they ate mostly in silence. James ate slowly at first, as if afraid the food might disappear. Then, as if realizing it wouldn't, he let himself enjoy it. When they finished, Richard leaned back, watching him. "What do you want now?" he asked. James set his fork down, wiping, his hands on a napkin. "I don't know," he admitted. "I never thought I'd make it past tomorrow, but maybe it's time to try." Richard studied him for a long time. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. "I run a foundation," he said. "It helps people get back on their feet. Job training, housing, counseling, whatever they need to start over. If you're serious about trying, this is a place to start." James stared at the card like it was worth more than any amount of money. His fingers hovered over it before finally picking it up. "You don't have to do this," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Richard shrugged. "Maybe not, but my grandfather believed in second chances. Maybe it's time I do too." James nodded slowly, tucking the card into his pocket. "Thank you," he said. And for the first time that night, Richard saw something new in his eyes. Hope. They left the diner, the rain finally letting up. As James stepped outside, he hesitated, looking back at Richard. "I'll try," he said. "I don't know if I'll get it right this time, but I'll try." Richard gave a small nod. That's all anyone can do. And with that, James walked away, not back into the darkness, but towards something new. Richard watched him go, the past still lingering, but no longer weighing him down. As he got back into his car, he looked down at his watch, remembering his grandfather's words. "You still have time to make this right." Maybe those words weren't just meant for James. Maybe they were meant for him too.